Welcome everyone to today's event to discuss the new book, Untangled, Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion with author Koshin Paley Ellison. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm Director of Programs for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. And let me say a few words on behalf of the lab, and then we will get underway. Like most of our events, this conversation is being recorded. And so you will get a link to that recording here in the next few days. If you need to leave early, or if we discuss something you want to come back to, you can always watch it as many times as you like. When you get the recording, there's a link to a very brief survey, maybe 5 or 6 questions, that just tells us what you thought about this and helps us plan for future events. I do want to thank the sponsor for today's webinar, which is the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. I'm sorry, I lost track of it for a second there, Koshin, but we're very happy to have them sponsor today's event. And I want to call your attention to 2 offerings that they have coming up. One is the Foundations in Contemplative Care, which is a 9-month training program and spiritual care partnership. I encourage you to check that out, as well as the Contemplative Care Retreat 2023, Turning Fear into Courageous Compassion. That will be in October. And so I encourage you to check that out. There'll be links to those in the follow-up email, and check out everything that the New York Center has to offer. Let me introduce Koshin, and then we will talk about his work. Sensei Koshin Paley Ellison is an author, Zen teacher, Jungian psychotherapist, and ACPE certified chaplaincy educator. After more than a decade as a chaplain and psychotherapist, Koshin co-founded the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, which offers contemplative approaches to care through education, care partnering, and Zen practice. Today, the center's methodologies are internationally recognized and have touched the lives of tens of thousands of individuals. I want to thank Koshin for being with us. And actually, I just remembered, Koshin, you were with us, I think it must have been 2019 or so. We had a webinar on chaplaincy from the Buddhist traditions. And so this is part 2. It only took 4 years to get around to part 2. So thank you for joining us. So let's begin. If you could just tell us a little bit about kind of the history of this book's, where did it come from and why did you write it and what do you hope to accomplish with it?
So it's great to see you, Michael, and glad to be here. And this book is really a map of the Four Noble Truths, which are the kind of grounding principles taught by Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha. And I got really interested, as our work as chaplains is the work of being with suffering. And as a teacher and as a learner myself, it is really important to really stay close to my own experience of suffering. And because I feel like that is actually where the root of compassion is, that I know struggle and I can struggle with you and be in the struggle, which to me is what is the beauty of compassion, that we can really be in it together. I'm just really aware of, even in this moment, where you can see outside the windows here the fires in Quebec. You can see how the light is different. The whole sky is covered in this orange cloud, and just really seeing the suffering that is happening to the plants and animals and people in Canada here is affecting us here. So it's the way of not turning away from suffering is so important, and to really learn how to be as clear as possible is, as far as I know, a life of practice. And so I began to reflect on wanting to go deeper into my own understanding of the 4 nobilities that Shakyamuni Buddha put together. And one of my methods of inquiry is writing and study. And so really wanting to move into them. And as a teacher, I really see my job as to really touch things myself. So I'm not going to tell you a philosophical understanding, but how I actually experience the philosophical. and how I experience these ideas. And I feel like that's really, to me, the work of chaplaincy also, which is really amazing. You know, the opportunity is to be intimate, not theoretically intimate. And so moving into this book was really about, was also going back in through my life and really reflecting on, where does my own suffering originate? Which is such an interesting question. You know, where does suffering originate when suffering has probably been in the world since the world has begun, and maybe before. So it was really, I narrowed it down to my lifespan mostly, and because I felt like I could actually talk about my experience. And what I also found was that I think I've always had a particular narrative where, in particular, about where my family comes from, which was mostly Eastern Europe, and deeply cut through and by the Holocaust. And for many years, I've been thinking about and researching and feeling into my own epigenetic trauma. And what I began to see was that it was not the whole truth, because what also I had experienced was that I come from a people who also all thought that everyone around them thought they were crazy, because they were the people who said, the sky's orange, there's trouble, you know. And people, family members around them were like, oh, that's not going to happen here, don't worry, you know. And they trusted themselves that what they were seeing as a problem and that needed addressing, and that this place was no longer safe, turns out to be a real thing. And so I come from these courageous people also, who were able to meet fear and keep going. And in many ways, I feel like that is the root of this book, Untangled, where it's really looking at, how do we meet our basic fear and struggle with courageous compassion? How do we get clear, and what do we do with that clarity? So my wish for this book, as you're asking, is for it to actually be a support to people, because I feel that what the world needs is not more books, but more companions. And so the book was written as a companion from how I understand my own struggle and pivot into freshness and possibility and freedom, so that I could walk with you.
Hmm. Now, I know that many of the people who are with us today, the Eightfold Path will not be anything new to them. They will be familiar with it. But I suspect there are some for whom it is not familiar. So if you could give us just sort of the Eightfold Path 101 and how that has structured the book itself.
Yeah. So there are a few other books, not a lot of books, but there are a few books about the Four Noble Truths, and which the Eightfold Path is the fourth. And what I found is that many of the books kind of focus on the Eightfold Path itself much more. And what I really wanted to do is actually write of at least half of the book to really explore the first couple noble truths that I felt like didn't get their due. So and to begin to tell about them, I just want to share a little bit about the story of the historical Buddha, who was just a guy like you or I, or a person. And he tried a lot of things. I always feel like it's a very contemporary story where he, tried this app and he tried that app, and he went to a yoga studio, he went to a Quaker meeting, he tried a lot of different things. And then eventually he realized, I need to learn how to stop and settle my mind and meet my fear, in particular, my fear of death.
Mm.
Because my fear is actually controlling me. And so what he did was he just stopped and he sat under this tree, which we now call the Bodhi tree because it was a fig tree. And he faced his fear head on. And he said, I'm not going to get up until I can really see through it, which I think in many ways is also a contemporary story for us as chaplains and as people, to really realize like, oh, I'm so distracted, or when I get uncomfortable, what do I do? Or when I get awkward, what do I do? And I feel like that his teaching is like, how do you just stay right there and not move away? Or when I feel afraid, what do I do? And how do we stay right there? And so the story goes that when he, woke up, he put his hand on the ground and he said, "Oh, house builder, thou art seen at last. The ridgepole is shattered. Nevermore will you build a house of sorrow." So that what he began to see, it was his own mind and heart that was actually causing the sorrow, building the house of sorrow. And building the house of loneliness, building the house of fear, building the house of distraction. And what we can do is meet it and actually change our relationship to it. And so his first teaching was the Four Noble Truths. And I remember being a little boy, 8 years old, and finding the Encyclopedia Britannica and looking up Buddhism. And back when there was like big books. remember big books. and reading the teachings of Buddhism are Four Noble Truths, and the first nobility is suffering. And I remember thinking, my goodness, I felt so seen. Because I grew up in homes where there was terrible things happening, sexual abuse and physical abuse and emotional abuse, but everyone was pretending like it wasn't happening. Like it was a gaslighting situation where they were good people, but didn't know how to deal, basically, and didn't know how to stop it. And so reading that first nobility, that there's a nobility to suffering, I felt like, yes, there is a nobility to our suffering. It's so powerful to remember that, oh my goodness, that my struggle, my entanglement has nobility. That what would it be like as chaplains for us to really go out and see people's suffering as noble? That our struggle, that our awkwardness, that our fear, our entangled stuff is noble. And to me, the nobility of it, it says, let's not turn away from it. And learning how to see it. And the second nobility is that there are causes to this, to this suffering, to this entanglement. And I call them the three giants. Classically, they're known as the three poisons, but I think that there's something helpful about them being giants because they're kind of like, like Godzilla, because they're just these enormous powers in the world and the power of rage and resentment, and the power of delusion, the fundamental delusion, thinking I'm not you. And the third one is greed, just like give me, give me, give me, give me, give me. And so I think of them as giants because in all of world mythology, there are these giants. And it's usually these exaggerated expressions, and they usually all have a certain quality. And so I felt like, yeah, that's more what it is than a particular poison in a certain way. They're just these things we have to reckon with, like in Greek mythology, that when the Titans are unleashed, they always wreak havoc. And so I think it is kind of like ourselves when we, allow our greed to get out of control, when it's kind of like rah, like running through the world, like give me, give me, give me, and I want to be seen, or whatever our particular form of greed is. We all have different valence, whether it's drugs and alcohol and sex, or buying stuff, or wanting to be liked, is to me like a really popular one. And one that I certainly have had. And and rage, and just like feeling and super reactive, right? That we have to reckon with that. So those are kind of a little overview of the second nobility. And there's a nobility to the Titans, right? To these giants, that they're part of the world. So the nobility is, to me, again, thinking about turning the light to where it isn't, so that we're actually learning to see how important our suffering and entanglement is, how important it is to acknowledge, yeah, we all have this stuff that we have to deal with, and we all kind of invest in that stuff too. And the third nobility is that we can change, that we can pivot, that we can do something totally fresh and new. It's like the most exciting thing. And to me, what's so intelligent and wise about this model, the four nobilities, is that you have to go through the first two. You can't bypass, like a spiritual bypass. I just want to get to that path, like I want to be spiritual, like when many years ago I used to want to be like Hello Kitty riding My Little Pony and being this helpful chaplain and running around, and bringing rainbows to everyone. But it wasn't real, but it was part of me wanting to be liked and wanting to be good, as opposed to just being a person. And the fourth is the path. The fourth nobility is that there is a path that we can actually do. And this is really the second part of the book, where we're really looking at these 8 folds of the path. And I added actually a 9th one, but they're really, to me, a map of how to actually cultivate wisdom and compassion. And to me, the only way that this Eightfold Path works is if we actually are really attuned to actually also how we struggle. So to really realize that, oh, right, it's about falling down and getting up into the path. So on the path, we're still going to fall down. We're not going to do it right. And it's not even about doing it right. It's about participating in a loving, engaged, and even thunderous way.
I'm wondering if you could dwell for a minute on this notion of suffering and how capacious that idea can be, because all of us, we can think about our own situated lives, we can think about people that we know, and we might be thinking, well, I don't have a a chronic illness. My material situation is good, and there are no enormous problems looming over me, so I'm not really suffering. But my own contention as a non-expert would be, no, actually we are all carrying some sort of suffering around. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of define suffering and help us kind of tease that out of everyone's lives, whether we have some huge obvious problem right in front of us or not.
Yeah, well, I use the word entanglement in the book instead of suffering, because a friend of mine, Diane Meyer, who's this really wonderful palliative care physician, she did this market research about the word suffering, and it turns out not very popular. And and the word for suffering, dukkha, could be translated in a lot of different ways, and sometimes it's often translated as suffering. It is also translated as stress. And the image of the word, its original word of dukkha, actually means like a cart with its wheel off its axis a little bit. So if we think about that, it's almost like the image I like to is called like a pebble in your shoe. Like, what's a pebble in your shoe these days? And we all kind of can come up with something that makes things not quite right. And to me, that's, walking down the street is really amazing, because then you start walking down the street and realizing that everyone has some pebble in their shoe of some kind. Everyone has something. And so I think that in some ways is a more helpful image of the pebble in your shoe, or like the axle just not being quite right. And what's so beautiful is that I remember being a young person. I was 17 when I went to this Buddhist retreat, and with James Hillman and Robert Bly and Jack Kornfield and Michael Mead. And it was this really amazing retreat. And it was Jack Kornfield who read this teaching, that says that it's actually in the book. It says, basically that the whole world is tangled in a tangle. Who will untangle this tangle? So I think it's also this capacity to realize, and what I realized in that moment was, my goodness, it's up to me to change it. And so I think, I also think about, as a chaplain, like, how do I support the people that I'm care partnering with at the bedside about how do they untangle? So tell me about how you untangle things, and how do you, when things feel knotted up, or there's a pebble in your shoe, or whether you're very sick right now or you're not, we all have some place of connection and intimacy. So I think the definition sometimes also of the word dukkha is dissatisfaction, and I think that there are just so many ways, and I think it's important to be skillful, is to really reflect on what is the word that connects. And I think as chaplains, it's really important to remember, if I'm using language that is not connecting, it's my job to actually find, like, what's the word that you would call that? It's such a great, to me, so great. Like, oh, I'm talking about entanglement and pebble in the shoe. Like, what kind of image would you use? It's such a wonderful, generous question.
You said right at the outset that one of the ways in which suffering helps, or entanglements help chaplains, is that because I've experienced this, now I can sit in yours with you. And I think that's very helpful for the chaplain themselves to keep in mind. what I'm wondering about is how can chaplains respectfully convey the fact that I can show up for you because I've suffered myself without turning the encounter into look at me. How do we telegraph that without making it about ourselves?
Yes, please do. Oh boy. Hmm. Well, one of the things that I learned when I was with James Hillman, and he would always talk about kinship libido. And so it sounds like like kind of a fancy word, but basic what it means is, do you have your people? Do you feel connected to people? And he felt that most people who are involved in, he wouldn't have said chaplains, he would have said psychoanalysis, but people who are involved in supporting or being caring for other people have, in some ways, as he would say, the worst case of a lack of kinship libido, like that they do not often foster loving relationships themselves, because there's a habit of kind of feeding off of being useful and helpful as a way of getting meaning, and kind of, which is also wonderful, right? It's also wonderful, but it needs to be balanced with a very nourished life. That way we don't need our care partners or patients, whatever word you're going to use. We like care partner here. That I am the tool. So if I'm not feeling nourished and connected in my life, then I'm going to kind of need you to connect to me and make me feel nourished in my life. And then I'm going to self-disclose because I want you to know me and I want to be known. And I'm not having enough areas or people in my life to actually attend to that. So I think that actually, ethically, as chaplains, part of our work is to untangle that. And how do we bring more balance into our intrapersonal and our interpersonal work, so that when we're doing clinical work, we're like, I'm ready to meet people and see what their deal is without having it to be about me, because I'm feeling really nourished and whatever that means for you. And I think also we have to reflect on, there was a new study that just came out that said, about 35% of people report not having a single friend. This was this past year. And so I think it's really important to remember that that probably is across the board. And so how do we really reflect on, okay, if that's the case, how do I begin learning how to have a friend? To me, it's like the deep prescription for well-being as a chaplain, as a human being, is that we are social creatures. And I often think about wire mumming, like remember those like monkeys with the wire mummy, and like the wire mummy doesn't help. We need warm blooded actual people where they have faces and they actually respond to us. And so it's beautiful. And you can hear the ambient. I would say it's another ethic of our work is that, sometimes we think as chaplains, like our work is just like this, but I think a lot has to be equally like this. So it's just giving and receiving equally. And actually, I don't even like those expressions, self-care and self-compassion either, because I feel like that's creating a division. Like, I'm going to go do my thing and then I'll come back. To me, it's actually this space between that we have to cultivate that includes ourselves.
Of course, this is not meant to be an event on spiritual literacy or defending, central tenets of Buddhism, but this gets to the heart of the interaction with patients in a healthcare setting. So let's assume that one becomes familiar with and accepts the nobility of suffering.
Mm,
How does that translate into a care encounter with someone
mm,
who is suffering, who very much wants to not be suffering anymore?
mm,
How do we, how can we hang on to this idea of the nobility of suffering while also
mm.
acknowledging this person doesn't want to be doing it anymore? Because obviously it's not appropriate for a chaplain to show up and say, well, there's nobility in suffering. Have a great day. I'm going to leave.
Ah,
How does that work?
uh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, please don't do that either. Well, putting any belief onto anybody is a terrible thing, in my view, and not helpful. I certainly don't need anyone to do that for me. I was recently, about a year ago, having surgery, and the chaplain came in and didn't ask me any questions and just said, like, I'm praying to God for you. And I'm like, and I said, I hope that's helpful for you. And yeah, so it's to me, it's the same idea, when like you come in with your own agenda. And I love, to me, it's such a reasonable thing. I've felt that way myself. Like, I don't want what's happening to be happening. So reasonable and so popular, and so to me as a chaplain, it's like, yeah, okay, so tell me about how you don't want to be what's happening to be happening. And how does that work? So what do you want to be happening? And to me, then it's as beautiful, can be a beautiful conversation around, like, yeah, you don't want this, what's happening now, and you want that. And so what's the connection between those things? How do you do that? And it's such a wonderful, place of inquiry, and it's so cool. Like, to me, that could be an amazing conversation, because it's so, like, who has not had that experience of not wanting that what's happening to be happening? So human. Actually, I noticed, like, we have these two Maine Coon cats, and and when they have certain things happening, they're like, they don't want what's happening either. Like, when they don't, like, for example, if I don't give them their food quick enough, they don't like that. They're like, ah. So I think it's so important to remember that it's just about being human, or even being an animal. We move away, actually, even little amoebas move away from things that they think are not food or nice. They're just like, ooh, little amoeba, So, like, it's just what means that we're a being in the world. And so for me, the tenderness that's always available is so amazing. And to not turn away.
That not turning away, I think, leads to another question that someone has asked. This is a wonderful question, which is, how do we meet others' entanglements without pity or judgment? And how do I meet my own entanglements without pity or judgment? That's a
Mm,
great question, Karuna. Thank you.
mm. Yeah, in one system in Buddhism, there's these things called the Brahma Viharas, and the near enemy, I believe, and actually I may get this wrong, but it's okay, to compassion is pity. So, and the near enemy is such an interesting teaching, and there's a very old teaching, I think like 2,000 years old or something like that. And pity is like, oh, poor you. It's so different. I remember, the most extreme experience I had of that pity was when my grandmother died. And all these people were like, oh, because people knew I was so close with her. They're like, oh, I'm really, and they put their hand on their heart and say, oh, I really feel for you, or I'm so sorry. And I knew that they all meant well, but I just wanted someone to sit next to me and actually not say anything, And so it's pity, I think, is really important to, in some ways, study inside of ourselves. It's like, when do we do that? Because we're just like moving back a little bit from compassion. And how do we learn how to just move a little bit closer, and say, what's that like? How's the day today? Or if someone's grieving, grief is like this, sometimes being caught in that riptide, and what are the waves like today? That's actually one of the things I like to ask people, especially if they're in deep grief. Just like, what are the waves like? Because I know my own grief and how it changes moment by moment. And I think that pity is just super unhelpful. Or actually, one of my dear friends, Megan Devine, has this like, she has like this great, her book is so wonderful about grief. And she wrote it, as part of a long process, but her partner drowned. And the book is called "It's Okay, You're Not Okay." I feel like if we could just if we need a slogan, that could be a helpful slogan when we're feeling pity. It's okay, you're not okay, is like, because sometimes we're just not okay. And learning how to just drop down more so that we can settle our heart and mind, so that we can feel awkward. Like what I was saying earlier, it's just really learning. To me, the antidote to pity is to really just drop into settling our heart and mind and realize, oh, I'm so anxious, or I'm nervous, I don't know what to say, I feel foolish, whatever all of those things are. And to feel all of those things and say, and I'm here, I'm with you, and I'm so glad.
I think a superficial reading of that type of encounter would say, but you're not doing anything.
Yes.
But if you take a few steps back, if someone says, oh, I feel so sorry for you, or whatever they may say, and great, you feel bad about my suffering, that does nothing. Or people will very often very kindly say, what can I do for you, in this moment of difficulty? If you're grieving a personal loss, there is nothing to be done, right? There's nothing to be done.
Well,
so to sit, yeah.
When I was so deep in my grief, I had this dear friend, my husband, who would just like sit next to me. And for a while, I couldn't even get out of bed. Now it would be called complicated grief, because I was very sad. And that was so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this other friend, Marco, who he was one of the few people who almost every week, I would see him and he'd say, how are you and Mimi doing? My grandpa's name was Mimi. It's like, how are the two of you doing this week? And it felt so tender, because the grief is that relationship. and feeling the physical loss and the longing and the wrench of that. And it was like one of the most generous questions. And he asked me that for, I don't know, a good year. It was the only one. And it was just amazing. Such a simple question. How are you and me doing? So beautiful.
There's an interesting question, and it involves a phrase that I think most of us have probably heard before, and I'm curious how it relates to what we've been talking about. And so this person says, that we have this saying, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. I've said this a few times to patients. If it seems appropriate, it seems to resonate, and more often not, they will open up. So thank you for that question. A phrase like that, which we have all heard, would indicate that you're going to experience unpleasantness and you have some control over how you react to it. Where does that fit into suffering as the first noble truth?
Yeah. So I shared earlier, I write about this in the book too, when I was very young. I really felt like I was in trouble.
Yeah.
And it was really through books and cinema that actually I began to find doorways and windows into other possibilities that were enormously important to me. And the first one was this movie called Star Wars that came out in the 70s. And this is not Mandalorian. This is, like Star Wars. It was just called Star Wars. And it was about this very whiny kid who I felt very related to because I felt very whiny. And he also lived in a pit, that with these people who were his family, but not his family, which I also related to. And I think in some ways, like it was such a powerful image, and that he met a teacher. And I never thought about that you could meet a teacher who was not in school. Just like a teacher would teach you about how to live, how to be alive, how to be lively. And at the same time, I was so inspired by that, but I didn't know how to get to Tatooine. I didn't know how to become a Jedi. I felt like kind of far from my life in suburban upstate New York, but then very soon after that, this other movie came out called The Karate Kid, which was the same cycle, this whiny kid who had trouble at home with his mom, and he met a teacher. But this time it was a karate teacher. And I realized, wow, that is workable. And so, and I'm getting to your question about pain and suffering. But I realized that there was a karate school in the basement of the local strip mall underneath Phase Drugs. And it was really gross down there. And it was not like one of those karate schools, like there's kids classes or it was just like karate school, and I was 11 years old. And I remember going into this space, it smelled disgusting, like mildew and sweat, which is quite a combination. And it was tough. And I felt at home. And it just felt really gritty and real. And the other thing is that turns out that he was a Zen guy, this Sensei White, the teacher there. And he would have us sit in Seiza, which is like on your knees on the wood floor, this makeshift wood floor, not on a comfortable cushion or in a chair. And it was very painful. And really, he would just like have us sit for like sometimes 20 minutes like that, where we were sweating. It was so like almost want to scream. It was so painful. And he would just walk slowly around us, and you will never be free until you can be free still with your pain. You'll never be free until you can be still with your pain. And for me, this was the beginning of compassion. So the difference between pain and suffering, what I learned at that karate school, sitting, sweating, and feeling excruciating pain was, first of all, I felt like I was learning superhero kind of stuff. And that sitting with your pain without running actually did feel like freedom. And it was also what I learned, that the people in my house and people in my life who were causing pain clearly did not know how to sit with themselves, didn't know how to sit with their own pain. So the suffering is caused with what we do when we feel pain and discomfort. We create a story, we react, we lash out, as opposed to like, this is so freaking hard and workable. So for me, the difference, maybe the most important difference, is that we can actually learn how to do something different. It's like that not turning away again. It's like actually this hand position, it's so interesting, I found myself keep doing this, is a hand position in Buddhism, or mudra, of fearlessness. It's like that learning how, even with our own pain, learning how to be fearless, which is to meet our fear with courage.
If I had to guess, most people that are here with us today are chaplains in a healthcare setting, and just judging by some of the introductions people have offered, that seems to be true. But of course, there are chaplains that are working in a wide variety of settings, universities and corrections, and I'm thinking especially of things like social justice movements. And so I'm wondering how we can combine this acceptance of the reality of suffering with what we perceive to be a moral imperative to change things in the world. So if I'm, concerned about climate change or whatever, how do we balance that acceptance of suffering is going to happen and it is noble, and there seems to be this thing that I see to be wrong, and I might be able to do something about it? Is there a balance there?
So great question. And my teacher from Japan was just here, and people were asking him about this very thing this past weekend. And it's one thing to see what needs tending to and tending to it. Like I have a friend who is unhoused and chooses to live unhoused. And, I tend to him. I see him every morning. He's my friend, and we connect. It's wonderful to help and serve the world. The world is filled with need. For me, I feel like that there's a really important difference between, you know, running out to change the world, and which I think sometimes happens. It's like, you know, the wonderful teacher Pema Chodron talks about, like people bonking each other over the head with, you know, peace signs. You know, it just like if we run out into the world like that, we're kind of not being still with our pain. That I think that transformative work comes from the inside out. And it doesn't mean that we don't do and serve and help. But I think it's just, where does it come from and how are we practicing it? To me, it's just such an important question. Where is it coming from? What are we doing? And for the sake of what are we doing what we're doing? And again, yeah, the world needs lots of help. And yet, where is it coming from?
Anne-Marie has a great question, and it gets to the issue of language and how we describe what people are experiencing. Anne-Marie says, how is suffering such as illness, old age, death, distinguished from, I'll put air quotes around it, pebble in your shoe suffering, right? I would assume that most people would not describe a terminal cancer diagnosis as, that's the pebble in my shoe right now. So, but Anne-Marie wants to know, is there a difference?
Well, Anne-Marie, it's really challenging to think about the differences and competitions of suffering. I think it's really tricky business. I feel like everything, of course, is waves and spectrum. That for some people, breaking a nail is the end of their life. And for other people, I actually once experienced a woman receiving a stage 4 diagnosis with such grace that felt actually real. And so moving. So I think that there's, you know, we also have to be careful about assumptions about what our bias, my bias about what is real suffering. Like for me, you know, I remember actually one of my first days as a chaplain, you know, a woman talk about how she broke her nail and was like completely having a situation about that. And at first I was like really judgy about it. I was like, I'm a chaplain, I'm supposed to be like really helping people, you know? But like the more I just entered her nail with her, a whole world opened up, of course, because of course it wasn't about the nail. But I saw how easily I could have just completely dismissed her. And I've been with many people where, you know, where I actually, when I learned how to stop saying, I'm so sorry for your loss. When this woman, her husband came in an emergency room and he died, and he was coded, and then they brought him back, and then they died, and then they brought him back, and you know, like how that goes sometimes. It's awful. And I remember saying to her, I'm so sorry for that. She's like, I can't even say the words that she said, but basically like telling me off. She's like, basically, how dare you? And what an assumption. She's like, I actually feel free for the first time. This is not a sorry moment. I'm so glad he's dead. I've been waiting a long time for him to die. So I think it's just really important. And I love your question, Shinko, and that we just have to be really careful about competitions and biases around suffering. Because I think actually many people that we work with as care partners in the hospital, hospices, nursing homes, all the places that we serve, where people are actually evaluating their own suffering and like, oh, it's not as bad as, I'm not in Ukraine, I heard someone say recently. Yes, you're not, but you are you. So how do you honor where you are?
I'm thinking about my wife and I just recently watched The Sopranos for the first time for me, and Tony has the line over and over, what are you going to do? Faced with a difficult situation, what are you going to do? It's a throwaway, but it's actually a good question to think about difficult situations. What are you going to do? On that wonderfully cultured note, I do want to note that we're coming up to the top of the hour here, and so I would like to thank you, Koshin, for your time and your wisdom, for writing the book, for putting the book out into the world. When you get that follow-up email, there will be a link to the book, and you can use the code. I think it's CIL20. I'll make sure the code is in there, and you get a discount from the book. We're very grateful to the publisher for providing that. I'll thank the New York Zen Center once more for sponsoring our event, and just draw your attention to those two offerings, the Foundations in Contemplative Care course. And I think somebody farther up in the chat a few minutes ago mentioned having gone through it and giving it a rave review. So please do check that out, as well as the Contemplative Care retreat in October. You'll have links to all of that material in the follow-up email. Koshin, thank you once more. I can't wait to talk again. Let's make sure it's not 4 years next time.
Exactly.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.